Hi, this is Paul. Welcome back to Learn DGlux5 channel. Today we're going to talk about layouts. They sound simple, however, everything starts with the layout. Your application at the very core is a layout. So we do need to spend some time on it because there are quite a few different options that you can use. Now, individual settings are simple enough. However, they can be combined in quite interesting ways that can sometimes be confusing. So we're going to take a look at horizontal layouts, vertical layouts, wrapping layouts, responsive layouts, and other aspects of configuring your layout to allow for future expansion, scalability, multi-platform functionality, and other dynamic layout options that will come handy when you start building your application. So let's go ahead and take a look. All right, we're at the controls here and let's explore layout options. So we're going to start with just looking at layout properties and what they do in the context of a single group. Here's the group. Right. One thing I would like to remind you right off the bat is that stage is also a group. And stage also has same layout options as any other group. Okay, so by default, a group is absolute layout. So what does that mean? That means that any content will stay where you place it within that group. So here I added a shape. Actually, let me add a border to this group so we can tell it apart from the background. Like so. There we go. So notice that my shape has X and Y offsets, right? 71 and 128 that are counted from the top left corner, right? So be 71 pixels here to the edge of the shape and 128 pixels from the top, right? So group does not do any modification of the shape's location. The shape is always in that coordinate position relative to the group. So if I move the group, obviously the shape will move with it, right? But the shape's position inside the group is going to remain where it is. And as I create more shapes and reposition them, everything is remaining where I placed it. Now, in addition, absolute layout has some scaling options. So by default, there is no scale, meaning as the group gets resized, the content does not. So content simply remains, and you can choose to have scroll bars or not. And by default, there are no scroll bars, as you can see. Right. But however, if we create a fit ratio scaling, it will take group's current size. So if we take a look at its current size, it's 668 by 472. So if we change to fit ratio scaling, right, and take a look at these properties, so it created content width and height that are currently equal to the group size. Right? So whenever you switch from non to fit ratio, it'll take group's current size and set it to its coordinate system size. What that means is that inner coordinate system is now always 668 by 472, regardless of how big the actual group is. So as I stretch it, you see that everything inside actually gets bigger. So what it really means is that each pixel is getting scaled, right? So I still have 668 by 472 pixels inside my group, right? But as I stretch my group, each of those pixels gets scaled, basically gets smaller or larger based on the overall group size, right? So if we, and by the way, fit ratio, of course, preserves the ratio of width to height. It's difficult to tell here because we have nothing outlining that, but if we add another component inside the group, and let's make it slightly different color, send it to back, and if we make it 100% by 100%, right, you notice that group's coordinate field is actually not the whole size of the group, but it's the fit ratio. So it'll preserve the ratio of width to height, right, as defined by the content, width and height. So as the group gets scaled, right, it will preserve that ratio. So it will not, your circles will stay circular, and everything and squares will stay square. And this will change if you change it to fit, right? So if you have a fit scaling, it will no longer try to preserve that ratio, allowing you to squish and stretch the content based on the group's overall size. There we go. Okay, so notice that the coordinates of each component inside this group are still the same, right? And I can actually go and change my coordinate system in the group. So if I make my content width, for example, almost double it there, right? You notice that everything now seems to be smaller because now my shapes are still the same size. They're 217 by 56. 78 by 77 in this case. However, that's 77 pixels are now less percentage from the width and height of group's coordinate system. So everything appears to be smaller. Okay, so let's go back to the no scaling and take a look at other layout options. So we've been looking at absolute, right? So now it's time to take a look at horizontal and vertical. So I'm going to remove everything we've added. Actually, no, let's keep it there just to see how things respond. So let's look at horizontal. So the minute I switch to horizontal layout, I have two options, right? I have horizontal alignment and vertical alignment. Basically, what this means is from what edge the group starts arranging components. Flex start means meaning it starts from left to right, and then stretch means it will try to stretch the vertical size of each child component to its full height vertically, as long as the component has dynamic sizing. So let me try to explain that. So currently, we're not seeing any items in here other than my shape, because my shape is 100% wide. So it takes up the full width of the group, forcing other two shapes off of the edge, right? So if I add a flex size, and we're going to go over the flex sizing shortly. So if I add an ability for the components to shrink, well, now it will shrink enough to fit other components on screen. So now we can clearly see how things are arranged vertically. Now, notice that my circle here is still a circle. It's still 77 pixels high. It doesn't stretch to the bottom. However, if I had made this auto by resetting it, right, then it gets stretched all the way, the vertical size of the group, because I have a stretch setting for vertical alignment. Right. This is the only alignment that allows you to have auto size on the child component. So meaning if I change this to flex start, meaning that the vertical alignment starts from the top and gets arranged going down, right? My circle disappears because now this auto has no reference frame, right? So there's nothing to tell it how big it should be. So I have to make it a fixed size, right, to get my circle back, or give it a percentage size, right? One of the two, but it cannot be auto in this case. Okay, so we're in a horizontal layout. What options do we have? So we have gap control. So gap control will allow you to set spacing between components. And then, of course, the edges as well. And so this will give you nice spacing around the edges, allowing you to arrange items neatly for your use case. All right, so now let's take a look at wrapping layouts. So what happens when you wrap stuff? When you deal with wrap layout, you there should be, if you deal with horizontal wrap, like in our case, so layout is horizontal and I'm going to enable wrap, it makes sense that your shapes are not 100% high, because otherwise, like in our case, it'll take the full height of the group and everything gets wrapped, gets pushed off outside of the group's boundaries. So I'm going to change my square here, or my rectangle, to be a fixed height, let's say 200 pixels. I'm sorry, that was width, and this will be the height. Let's say 150. There we go. So now I have a wrap layout, and what does it mean? It means that as I add more components, they're going to keep getting added horizontally until there's not enough space for the next component. Then it'll get shifted to the next line. So let's see actually how this happens. And by the way, now we also get a setting of vertical gap. Since we're going to have multi-line arrangement here, we have a chance to set a gap between the vertical rows. So let's add the gap as well. So let's add more rectangles and see how they behave. There you go. So as the group becomes bigger, right, as soon as it has enough space to fit that rectangle, right, it jumps to row above, right? As soon as space shrinks, it'll shift the component down below. Now, here's another way to arrange this. Notice that this gap is always present here, right? So as soon as it's big enough to fit a component, the component will jump in there. But until then, right, you just have a gap. So let's say you wanted, you would like the other components to stretch horizontally to take up this gap at all times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all the components. Actually, let's just do all the shape, all the rectangles. And I'm going to give it an ability to flex grow. All right, so notice what happened here. So these components will shrink or grow, right, within this remainder of space until there's actually enough space to fit another one, at which point it will jump just like it did without the flex shrink. So the only difference here is that extra remainder of space, when it's not enough for another component of the specified size, in our case 200 pixels, right, it will get taken up by other components stretching to fit. But as soon as you have enough space, again, in our case 200 pixels, it will move the component from the row below to row above, right, and start the stretching all over again. Okay, and this is a good segue to talk about flex shrink and flex grow. You're going to find these settings on just about anything here. Well, not just about, on every component. And let's explore what they do. To clearly see the operation of flex shrink and flex grow, I think it's easier to take a look at just purely horizontal group. Here, I'm going to make one here. Make it horizontal and give it some border so we can see it. I'm going to copy this shape and paste in my group and make sure this shape is okay. It's already flex shrink, flex grow. So let's turn off flex shrink and flex grow. Right. By default they're zeros, so we'll keep it at that. And vertical layout, let's do center, so it's nicely arranged. There you go. So what is flex shrink, flex grow? This is simply a ratio at which the component is allowed to grow or shrink in relation to other components within the same automated layout. And by automated layout, I mean, of course, vertical or horizontal. It has no effect at all in the absolute layout. It only works in horizontal or vertical. Okay, so if I say I only have one component in my group and I give it a flex grow of 1, it will immediately stretch to the whole size of the group because there's nothing else to limit its space, so it will grow to the size that it can be within that parent. And it doesn't matter if I make it 2, 5, or more, right? So as long as it's 1 or above, it will take up all the available space. Okay, so let's go back to 0 and let's add more components. And let me add a gap between them so we can clearly tell them apart. And add gap to left and right. There. So now let's see. So both of them have no flex, shrink, or grow. So I'm going to add that ability to one of them. Notice that one immediately takes up whatever space is available after the second one is already fitted inside this group. So it just takes up the slack basically. But I'm going to go ahead and add that flex grow to the other one as well. Okay, now they both have a flex grow of 1, meaning they both grow and shrink at the same rate, which makes them equal. So as the group changes its size, as long as it's big enough to fit the default size of the component, and it's 200 pixels. Remember, we did not allow it to shrink yet. So it's 0 flex shrink on both. It means they cannot shrink less than their specified size of 200 pixels. But if group is bigger or big enough to fit both of them at their default size, they'll start growing at the same rate. However, if I give flex grow of 2 to one of them, what you will notice is that it will now grow at twice the rate of the other one. Right? The same rate, I can give rate of half. Right? So basically, these settings simply control the ratio at which components resize relative to each other. Right? So if both of them are 2, they will grow at the same rate. It doesn't matter that it's 1 or 2 or 3 or 5. If it's equal, then the ratio is equal. Then they will always be the same size. However, if these settings are different, they will grow and shrink at different rates. Right? So similar situation is happening with flex shrink, right? And that takes effect when the component has to shrink below its specified size, in this case 200 pixels. So above 200 pixels, so if the group has enough space for 200 and above, right, flex shrink does not have any effect. However, when we specify flex shrink of 1, when the group gets small enough where 200 by 200 is no longer fitting, it will allow it to shrink now. Right? So notice that one of them shrinks. Right, this one, because it has flex shrink of 1. The other one does not, because it has flex shrink of 0. Right? The minute I give it flex shrink, that also starts shrinking, and now they're always equal again because the setting for flex shrink is the same, 1 and 1. So they shrink at the same rate. Similar to flex grow, if I give it a different rate of shrinkage, it will shrink at a different rate compared to the other one. Right, so where's this used? Well, you use this to size or limit how things get sized in your layouts, in dashboards especially. So you often have elements that, for example, you want scaled as more space becomes available, for example, on bigger screens or higher resolutions. But you also have elements where it doesn't make sense to scale them up or down. Some things just don't become any more useful when they get bigger. As an example, button, right? Button is a button, and making the button huge does not make it any more functional or any easier to use for the user. However, a component like a chart could definitely benefit from taking up more space if more space is available, right? Because it can simply render more content within that space, compared to a button that cannot. It'll just remain the button. It'll just get bigger, but it won't have any more content. Same thing with a gauge, for example, right? At certain size, gauge is friendly and usable, but making the gauge bigger does not give you any more information. So That's how you would control whether you want components to grow and take up the space you have available or remain the size that you specify from the get-go, and basically keep your nice arrangement and make your design stay together and don't grow or shrink beyond your specified limits. Okay, so we've explored horizontal wrap, and flex, shrink, and grow settings. Next, we're going to quickly brush over the vertical layout, which is, as you can imagine, is virtually identical to horizontal, but works in a different plane. And then we're going to try to build a basic navigation layout that gives you a nice start with your web application. So let's go ahead and take a look at vertical layout. All we're going to do is take the same group that we already have and change its layout to vertical. Right? And first we're going to turn off the wrapping and delete our flex size demonstration here. There we go. So vertical layout, as you can imagine, does what the horizontal does, except in the vertical plane. And here, the sizing switches. Basically now, the horizontal sizing becomes less relevant. Basically here in this 200 pixels, and it remains 200 pixels, right? If I can make it percentage based, for example, 50%, and flex size no longer affects horizontal sizing. It now applies to vertical sizing. So flex size settings always apply to the plane that is affected by its parent, right? So if my parent is vertical layout, then it's my vertical size that is affected by flex shrink and flex grow settings of the component. So in my case, all these shapes, right, they'll have 1, meaning that they're allowed to flex shrink or flex grow, this time vertically. And therefore, they all get squished or stretched equally, except for my two circles, which are not allowed to flex, shrink, or grow because the settings are 0 or null, which is the same thing. Okay, so if I wanted one of those shapes to not shrink and remain my 150 pixels, I simply specify that in my flex shrink size, and of course this stops it from being shrunk. It does not stop it from being stretched, however, if the size allows. Right? So in exactly the same fashion, you will find the wrapping to work, except this time it'll wrap in columns, not rows. So you'll see components get arranged vertically, and when it runs out of space vertically, it'll start another column and start arranging them vertically in that column. Everything else works exactly the same as horizontal. Like I said, the only thing is it switches horizontal and vertical sizing of the component as far as which one is now affected by the flex size settings. Okay, now the cool part. Let's try and build a basic application layout, something actually usable. We're going to start by configuring our stage. Right? So I mentioned that stage is also a group, and it can have layout settings. Right? So in my case, I'm going to use the stage for the initial layout, which is going to be vertical because I want to split it into two parts, header and then everything else. So I made it vertical, and I'm going to add a group and immediately blow it up to 100% by 100%, but then reduce the vertical size to, let's say, 60 pixels, and set the flex shrink to 0. Right. Notice that if you add a component to a group, or in this case stage, that already has one of the automatic layouts selected, so anything but absolute, the new components will always have a default value of shrink to be 1. Right? So if you're adding component to absolute layout, both flex shrink and flex grow are 0s by default. when you add the component to vertical or horizontal layout group, by default, the flex shrink is set to 1. So I went ahead and changed it back to 0 because I don't want my header to get shrunk at all when my playing field changes. And I'm going to name it header. And I'm going to make my header horizontal layout right away, because what I plan to do is maybe have a logo there, and then a title, and then maybe some clickable items at the end there, basically arranged horizontally. Right? And I'm going to give it a fill. I'm going to use this maybe blue color. And next thing I'm going to do is add another group. And again, blow it up to the full size, 100% by 100%. Right, I'm going to fill this, actually let's keep it white, kind of like that. Right, and this is going to be my main section. I'll just call it that, main. And what I'm going to do is, just for aesthetics, I'm going to go ahead and add an effect, box shadow, to my header. Creates a kind of shadow effect, offsetting my header from the rest of my content. And I'm going to add a small underline there, again, to sharpen this up just a little bit, because shadow does make it a little bit fuzzy for my liking here. And I'm going to use kind of darker blue, almost gray color in there. There we go. So next, now I have my main, which is lower section here. I'm going to split it into 2 sections horizontally. So it's going to be horizontal, and my left part will be navigation, right? And my right part will be the actual content. So I'm going to go ahead and add a group. Again, blow it up, but then set the vertical sizing to fixed size and turn off flex shrink. That's going to be my navigation. Now, why did I turn off my flex shrink? Well, because like the components I mentioned before, the navigation does not benefit from being shrunk or stretched widthwise. Navigation is easiest when it remains the fixed size, no matter how big your playing field is, right? So just because your items there get bigger, they don't become any more informative, right? So I'm going to keep it at 200 pixels wide, and it's going to stay that regardless of how big the rest of the screen is, right? And next to it, I'm going to add another group. I'm going to call it content. Now this group, remember, by default it gets set to flex shrink of 1, which is fine because this group will shrink and grow with the screen availability. So the more space the screen has, the more content you can fit. Okay, now I'm not going to go as far as to fill this up with actual items, at least not the header. But I will throw a few sample items into navigation just so it's easier to tell what's what. So I'm going to make my navigation a vertical layout, and I'm going to add just a simple text. Actually, no, let's go back. I'm not going to add a text. I'm going to add another group to my navigation. Again, blow it up, and then go and change the size back to a fixed amount. You notice I'm doing this a lot. Rather than going and setting the width, the X and Y to 0, 0, and then width or height to 100%. It's easier for me to set all of them to that with one click, which is, this full size button sets the X and Y to 0, 0, and width and height to 100% by 100%, and then go back and change one of those sizes back to what I want. It's just a little bit quicker, so you'll see me doing this a lot. Anyway, so this is going to be my header. Now, look, hierarchically, this is a navigation header, right? Not my application header. Horizontal layout, and let's do center for vertical. Give it a little bit of spacing left and right. Add a text. make it darker. Navigation. And next to the text, and by the way, I'm going to make the text flex grow. So it takes up all available space in the header except for, and what I'm gonna do is add an icon. Now I don't want to look for icon image, so I'm just gonna do a text icon like this. Make it clickable. All right. And this is going to be the icon that will collapse or expand navigation. And then to basically set the navigation apart from the rest of the content, again, I'm going to add a bit of a shadow effect, box shadow. And I'm going to also add a line, just like we did for the application header. So on the right-hand side, I'm going to pick this as my color, do solid line. There. Maybe that's actually way too dark. So do something less obvious, like this. Like so. All right. So what I want to do is I want my my navigation to be able to collapse and expand as needed. Maybe just switch between the full width and then just a single bar for icon-based navigation. So again, we're gonna use some concepts that we haven't covered in my videos yet, but we will have episodes on actions and animations and all that stuff. For now, I'm just gonna use it as is. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to set up 2 states, right, that will affect my navigation group position, not size. Now, here's why I want to do position. So, by the way, so this position is 0. Of course, it's anchored to the left here, like everything else in the horizontal layout. My size is 200. Now, if I affect my size, what's going to happen? All right, notice what's happening to the title, right? I want everything to slide back to the left. I don't want things to shrink in some way because it just doesn't look right. So instead of affecting the width of my navigation, I'm going to affect the X position by offsetting it into negative space like so, right? So I'm gonna have this state block affect this position. All right. I'm gonna set it to -200. Sorry, not 200. I do want to keep a bar remaining. So let's do -160. So 40 pixels wide bar will remain. I will actually add an animation effect. Let's do elastic in and out. So let's do bounce. And animation duration of, let's say, 0.5 seconds, half a second. And I'm going to turn off serialization because I don't want that value to be saved with the page. We'll go over that in different episodes. So this state block will collapse my navigation into a bar, like this. All right. Now I'm going to have another one by duplicating this one, which will do the opposite. We'll set it to 0, like so. And I'm going to add a boolean that will switch between the 2 states. All right. Now, I could just take click on and click off events from this button and bind them directly to state blocks. However, the reason I'm doing this based on a Boolean parameter is this will give me an option to expand or collapse navigation via other means, not just this button. And I won't have to synchronize it what the next state is, right? If I clicked expand on the button here, the next state will be collapse. But if I try to do it from elsewhere, I would need to know what that state is in order to do something else, to do the next state, like expand. This way, I'll be able to set the Boolean to true or false from anywhere in the application, right? And I'll know exactly what will happen to navigation. So it won't be hard-coded to this icon, right? And I won't have to know what the prior state was to make sure the next state is what I want. Anyway, so I'm going to use the if block here to say that if the current state is already true, meaning navigation is already shown, right, then I'm going to send X to my output, which will execute the collapse state block. So let's name it collapse. And this time I'm going to try to spell it right. And this guy will be expand. Right, so this block will send an X to an output. And remember, to invoke anything, you just need a value other than null. Any value, any change of value will invoke an invoke property, a trigger. And the other block will send the X if it's false, like so. So now, right, simply triggering the Boolean will affect my navigation. So now I can, first of all, I can now link this Boolean to my icon here to display arrows facing the proper way. So I'm going to hold control for a binding dialog. I'm going to do data mapping. I'm going to say when it's true. So when it's already expanded, I should be showing the collapse button. Otherwise, expand. Right, and oh, looks like I mixed this up. So edit. Oh, yeah. Gonna replace these like so. And actually, you know, okay, that's why it confused me, because I actually mixed them up. So this guy should be false, and this should be true. Yeah, because I had them working in reverse, because my Boolean is supposed to be true when I want to show, and in my case, it was actually true when it's collapsed. There, so now I can go back to my binding dialog and do it the right way, which is what I did initially. So show collapse icon when it's expanded, and show expand icon when it's collapsed. There we go. So last thing I need to do is to actually have the click on this icon affect my Boolean. All right, and I'm going to jump into my icon, my binding dialog here, and I'm going to have a state block here, which is going to be affecting my Boolean. Oops. Right. Again, I don't want serialization. Don't worry about what it is. We'll go over it in another episode at some point. I don't want a hard-coded value to be set of this block. What I want is just the opposite of what the current value is. So I'm going to use a not block. Right, that's what this block will set the value to, the show nav value. And I'm going to use onClick, right, of this text to invoke that. Let me rename this. Let's call it toggle here. Toggle nav there. Now, one thing to keep in mind, when I rename something, especially using Control-Enter to save the new name, where it doesn't just change the label, it actually changes the system name of the component, the bindings get updated automatically. So anything that's bound to and from it will get updated, and it will, everything will keep working. However, if you have any path references to it, like if this state block was affecting my toggle button, it does not. It's affecting the Boolean, the show nav Boolean in the data flow. But if this was affecting the toggle nav button, this path would not have been updated when I renamed the component, right? So you have to make sure to go in and drop update a path or retype it. So anywhere where it's not a binding but simply a text referencing your path will obviously not get updated if you change the component name. So do keep that in mind. Okay, so it's done. Let's see how that works. And it works great. So the only thing I have remaining is content. Right, now, in the interest of keeping this episode to a reasonable length, I'm not going to actually go and fill out this content. However, I'm not going to get rid of this page with build either. This gets saved, and in the next episode, we'll pick up where we left off by adding more meat to the bone here, and we'll keep building this out through various episodes to hopefully end up with a cool little application of our own. All right, well, this is it for this week's episode, and let's get back to the studio. Hey, welcome back. So, like I said in the beginning, this is not a difficult concept when you look at individual properties, but it can get pretty overwhelming when you're trying to combine many variables together to achieve that specific look and behavior that you need for your application. So hopefully this episode made it a little bit easier for you and gave you some ideas and some methods to configure your own layout. Like I mentioned, we'll be continuing this build out of a basic web application in further episodes, and we'll also be taking a look at things like mobile alternative interfaces and touchscreen interfaces and so on. That's all coming in the future. Until then, my name is Paul Sinenko, and go build something.